As you've heard, we're going to be exploring the power of story this summer, especially storytelling as it's found in the Bible. But this morning, we're going to have two sermons for the price of one. So the first sermon is just about story generally. I don't know if we can really qualify it as a sermon necessarily. And then the second one, you can decide which one is the free one. But the second one is going to be about a story in the Bible. We're starting with story in general because it's my belief that for most of us, if not for all of us, story is everything. After all, we each experience life as a story. It has a beginning, it has an ending, and everything that happens in between has all the classic elements of story: setting, characters, plot. Various settings, actually, as we move about in our lives, and some of those settings are pleasant, some of them are less so. Our life stories have characters in them, as you know. Some of those characters are pleasant, others less so. And these characters in our story come and go, except for ourselves. Each one of us is the main character of our story. Everyone else, including those loved ones you see with you in the room this morning, everyone else is just a supporting character in your story. And if that sounds unfair, just remember that for all of those people, you are just a supporting character. So it works out. And of course, our story has a plot often driven, as in good stories, by tensions of various kinds, challenges to be overcome. Sometimes the plot of our life is predictable, which we complain about. Sometimes the plot of our story is unpredictable, which we complain about. Often there's foreshadowing in our lives. Sometimes we pay attention to it. Often we don't. And again, the way we experience life does contain all the elements of story, but there's a lot more to it than that. Because I believe that most of us need story to make sense, not just make sense of the shape of our lives, but to find meaning and significance in our lives. When something good happens, or bad, or unexpected, or repetitive, we want to know why. We want to know why so we can make sense of it, and really the only truly satisfying answer to why is a story of some kind. Why did the stock market crash? We want a story. We are not satisfied when we are told there isn't one. Tell us how you met. We want a story. Why are you here? We want a story. In the My Life So Far series, we love listening to people's stories. And there's another one coming up next month. Thank you, Ted. Even something unliterary and unstory-like, like science, can be understood as the search for the stories that make sense of the physical world all around us. Sometimes it's something like a physics equation that describes the gravitational pull that we see and experience everywhere, and that is a kind of story. Sometimes it's more obvious, though, in the more historical sciences. So, how do stars form? What causes them to ignite? How do the nuclear fusion furnaces in their cores turn lighter elements into heavier elements? What causes some of those stars to explode at the end of their lives as supernovae? Explosions that in the past have scattered heavy elements throughout the universe and made possible carbon-based life on this planet. Life that includes you and all the supporting characters you see around you. We need story to answer questions like that. Sometimes that story is dressed up in scientific language, but it's story. And of course, we do know our own life stories best, but even there where we are the experts, we still need the storytelling of others. For example, we don't recall the first years of our lives, so we rely on the storytelling of those who were there. We can't predict in detail the last years of our lives, but thanks to the storytelling of others, we do have a sense of where things are going and what's likely. There is foreshadowing. But even in the present, during every moment of every day, we still aren't fully aware of all that's going on in our lives without help from the stories of others. Even something as simple as asking a loved one, "How was your day?" produces a story that feeds our story and helps us better understand ourselves and our lives in all of its richness. All sorts of other stories feed into ours, our stories feed into many others, and all of it is part of even bigger stories. Stories within the story. In The Lord of the Rings, which is sort of like the second backup scripture for me, in The Lord of the Rings, Sam and Frodo have a moment where they make this kind of connection between their little story and the bigger stories that had been going on since before their time. As they take a break in a mountain pass, and they are about to cross over into the dark land of Mordor on their seemingly hopeless quest, at that moment, Sam mentions that they're in the midst of the kind of story he liked to hear as a child. Dangerous, adventurous, exciting. But he remembers that while some of those stories ended all right, many did not. And he says, "I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into." And later, as he realizes something about a gift that Frodo had received from an elven queen who had lived a long time and who features in some of the ancient great tales, Sam cries out, "Why, we're in the same tale still." And then he asks, "Don't the great tales ever end?" And this, I think, is something universal in one way or another. We all wonder, along with Sam, what sort of a tale we've fallen into. And eventually we come to realize that our individual stories are part of bigger stories, and in general, we are here this morning because of our sense of the great tale, if I can capitalize it, the great tale that never ends. So, we exist in story form. We need story to make meaning, to discern purpose. And because of all of that, I want to remind you that we're not just story listeners. We are also story makers. And I believe this is instinctual. It's how we make sense of things. It's how we bring, like God does, order to chaos, fullness to emptiness. We are made in God's image, and so we are creators. Often, that is healthy and enriching, but it can also be challenging at times. For example, how many times when loved ones are not showing up when we thought they should, how many times do we become story makers of all sorts of tragic tales explaining why they're not here? Tales that almost always aren't true and certainly aren't helpful, and yet we make them. Athletes and performing artists at a very high level, they have to be very careful about this story-making instinct. At their level, so much of their work and preparation goes beyond their particular expertise into the realm of controlling the story-making, guiding their story-making instincts in helpful directions. But whether we're high-level athletes or not, I think you all know the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves have a profound effect on the quality of our lives. So story-making can be healthy, it can be challenging, but it is with us. It can also be just plain silly. A source of lighthearted joy, story-making. And that, too, is part of being human. And I believe the silliness of lighthearted, joyful stories is also part of being made in the image of God. And it's one of the things I want to draw out this summer is some of the serious but lighthearted, funny stories that we find in the Bible. You know, jokes are like this. They come to us in story form, and then they surprise us with an absurd ending or plot twist. That's how they work. Even our jokes are in story form, and we delight in them. I want to bring you an example this morning. Now, because it's summer, and we're all trying to be more lighthearted in the summer, 'tis the season to be superficial. So I'm going to tell you a true story that has a false story inside it. I'll leave it to you to unravel that. At the beginning of this past school year, and as most of you know, I'm a part-time high school teacher of senior level students. At the beginning of this past school year, I had a really neat group of grade 12 kids, and they asked me, usually high school students don't see you, the teacher, as a fellow human being. That they're not there yet. But these kids were, and so they asked me, what is teaching like? And as part of my answer, I said that it's a lot like parenting, but accelerated. I only teach grades 11 and 12, so over the course of 2 years, I meet these wonderful human beings. I fall in love with them in the sense that I become irrationally interested in their well-being. Their stories become part of my story becomes part of their stories, and then they leave me. They go away on to the appropriate, healthy next stage of their life. So every June I grieve a little bit, and I go through something like empty nest syndrome, but every year, over and over and over. So I told them that. There were some real characters in that class, and 2 of them, in particular, latched onto the idea that teaching is like parenting, and they shouted out, "We have a dad!" And on tests, they started signing their names with Teel as their last name. And it did not stop. All year, it even spread a little bit like a virus to some other students. It's a very strange experience by the end of the year, marking this exam where half of them were Teals. The beginning of June came around, and these kids said, "Hey, Dad, we should have a family meal together to celebrate the end of the school year. Let's meet at Big Wheel Burger." So we made arrangements. 4 of these kids were able to make it on this particular day. They would make their own way. I would make mine. And we'd meet there at 3:30 in the afternoon. I figured it was safe, it'd be empty. I got there only 3 minutes late. But there they were, all lined up, standing side by side on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, jumping up and down, and acting very excited to see me. I was kind of used to their absurd behavior, so I didn't pay much attention to it. You get to a certain point where you're just immune. But this I did notice. When we walked inside, the woman behind the cash register gave me a very, very strange look. And as is so often the case in our lives, to explain why she gave me a strange look, I'm going to have to tell you a story. As it turns out, those 4 boys had arrived 15 minutes early. And being the middle of the afternoon, there were virtually no other customers in the restaurant, just these 4 young men sitting at a table with no food. Feeling self-conscious, one of them got up and walked over to the cashier. He said, "I feel like I should explain. We're waiting for someone who's very special to us. This is a very exciting day. I know it doesn't look like it," he said, "but all 4 of us are brothers. And you should know that it does not look like it. And today, we're about to meet our Father for the very first time." You see, we are brothers because he was the sperm donor for each one of us. So we're just waiting for Dad until we order food. Not much later, I walked in, and now you know why the cashier gave me a very, very strange look. She must have been thinking, were there no pictures in this catalog? I ordered first. Then the student behind me said, "I'll have what Dad's having." And it went down the line. When our burgers arrived, the cashier, when asked, took our picture together as we each held up our identical meals. And the students did not tell me what they had done until it was too late. I was an innocent victim. One of my sons is actually visiting here this morning. There he is, Michael. And did I get it was it pretty accurate? Oh, right, we all look exactly alike. That's true. He wants you to know that. My point in all of this, remember, there's a point, is that we are story makers, and sometimes just plain silly ones. That student perceived an emptiness and filled it with a silly story. A false story, but a silly, fun story. And that cashier had an answer when she went home and was asked, "How was your day?" She had a story. Okay, that's it. That was sermon number 1 about story in general and how it's just actually important to us and a source of deep, deep joy and great delight, among other things. Here comes sermon number 2. In a lighthearted way, we're going to explore this summer and celebrate some of the excellent storytelling that we find in the Bible. And this morning we are looking, as you already know because Pamela read it, the story of the man born blind. This story is only found in the Gospel of John. It's hopeful, it's tragic, it's funny. It's a lot like our lives. It tells the complex and paradoxical truth about what it means to be human, how we get things right and wrong at the same time, it seems like. How the blind see and the seeing are blind. Now, in general, as a disclaimer, I would say that John is not the gospel I'd recommend turning to for great storytelling. He starts off with a long theological essay disguised as a poem. "In the beginning was the Word." Oh, John, please. And he includes some almost eternal prayers and speeches by Jesus. No offense. But on the other hand, to be fair to John, that's where we find the story of the woman caught in adultery. A powerful story. That's where we find the ridiculous story of the foot race to the empty tomb on Easter morning. And John is where we find the story of the man born blind. So let's give him credit. Let's let him do his storytelling magic. So here we go. And I'm, with very few interruptions, going to read it to you. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. His disciples asked him, I didn't include this morning in Pamela's reading because I thought maybe not kid-friendly. Rabbi, the disciples asked, who sinned? This man or his parents that caused him to be born blind? That's it. Those were their two choices. We're blaming the victim in some way, but we just don't know exactly how to blame the victim. Jesus said neither this man nor his parents sinned, but because this happened, the works of God can be displayed in him. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And having said this, Jesus spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, Jesus told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, can this be the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was, others said, no, it only looks like him. Meanwhile, the guy's just sitting there like, stop talking about me like that. And he jumps in, I am the man. Then how were your eyes opened? They said. And I will just tell you this man is very practical. His answers are all very practical, not very cosmic or theological. Just the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went, and I washed. Then I could see. Sort of like the very basic journalistic answer. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know. So they brought the man who had been born blind to the Pharisees. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes, that day was a Sabbath. Pharisees were pretty busy on these Sabbath days, weren't they? Monitoring. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked the man who had been born blind how he had received his sight. And here it comes again, the journalistic, very straightforward answer. It's even shorter this time. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees, in response, said, this man Jesus is not from God, for he doesn't keep the Sabbath. Because making the mud is technically making clay, and making clay is not allowed on the Sabbath. But other Pharisees asked, but how could a sinner perform such a miraculous sign? So they, the Pharisees, were divided. In their division, they turned again to the blind man. Well, what do you have to say about Jesus? They asked him. After all, it was your eyes he opened. Now it's the guy's fault. He has to solve this theological conundrum for them. What have you to say about him? And the man replies very carefully. He is a prophet, which was a bit like saying he is a saint, someone who's holy, through whom some miracles sometimes happen. Right? Don't want to go too far, don't want to say too little. But the Pharisees still didn't believe that he had been born blind and that he had only recently received his sight until they sent for the blind man's parents. So the parents now come in. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see? The parents also answered carefully. Everyone's afraid of the Pharisees. We know that he is our son. They're willing to make that declarative statement. And we know that he was born blind, getting a bit more controversial, But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself. And then John tells us his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who said Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why, John explains, his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So, for a second time, the Pharisees summoned the man who had been born blind. Give glory to God and tell the truth. This was more of like an official courtroom kind of oath. Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then the Pharisees said this, we know that this man Jesus is a sinner. It's not really a question. The formerly blind man replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Here's one thing I do know. See if you recognize this line. I once was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And at this point, the man who had been born blind, who was being very journalistic and practical, loses it. He just starts to give it back to the Pharisees now. He's tired of this. I think he figures, I got nothing to lose here. The man answered the Pharisees, I've told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him, and they said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, Jesus, we don't even know where he comes from. And the formerly blind man is on a roll now. He answers, oh, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from. And yet, he opened my eyes. And then he uses Pharisee logic against the Pharisees. Here it comes. This guy says, fine, you want me to go theological? I'll go theological. Here you go, pals. You ready for this? The blind man. We know that God does not listen to sinners. This is the Pharisee logic, remember. God listens to the godly person who does God's will. Nobody has ever heard of anyone opening the eyes of a man born blind. So, if this man Jesus were not from God, he could do nothing. That was Pharisee logic thrown back into the faces of the Pharisees. They replied as people often do when their own logic is thrown back in their faces and expose them as not being careful thinkers. To this the Pharisees replied, you were steeped in sin from birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. The end. Now, it doesn't feel like the end if you're actually reading in the Gospel of John, because John does add a little spiritual epilogue where, and you can read it for yourself and see if I'm being fair here, but here's Teel's paraphrase. Jesus finds the formerly blind man and says, do you believe in the Messiah? And the man says, where is he? And Jesus says, is me. And the man says, okay. But that's not really part of the story, where we have this scene with the Pharisees and all this stuff and the neighbors. So we're just going to set that aside and focus on this amazing story. The disciples begin by wondering if the man is blind because of his own sin or his parents' sin, blaming victims, as we humans have been doing for a long, long time. But amazingly, the Pharisees end by doing much the same thing. You were steeped in sin from birth. How dare you lecture us? This poor guy was a victim when he was blind and a victim when he was healed. He was just sort of piled on the whole way through. Even his parents, in some ways, threw him under the bus. The man's neighbors don't even believe it's him anymore, which is really kind of weird. And then rather than celebrating that he's healed, instead they frown and drag him to the Pharisees. Meanwhile, as we heard, this man born blind goes from being very practical and passive to being aggressively salt of the earth, just giving it back to the Pharisees. The Pharisees, who hold themselves up as those who should lead the spiritually blind, the Pharisees can't even see the divine miracle that is right in front of them, which is the perfect irony in this storytelling. The blind man sees, and the Pharisees are blind. And the blind man's parents are both pathetic and hilarious. We don't know, ask him, whatever. For the past year, we've been exploring the ambiguity found in the Bible. How the Bible is actually not filled with easy answers, so much as it's filled with complicated examples of people getting it right, people getting it wrong, people getting it a mixture of right and wrong. And this story, I think, fits right into that. For example, should the man born blind have been more quick to see that Jesus was the Messiah? Can we blame his neighbors for being confused and turning to the authorities? Should his parents have stood up for him more? Should they have considered his undeniable and miraculous healing to be more important than their fear of the Pharisees? Were the Pharisees right about the law prohibiting the making of clay? Were they wrong for pointing that out? The man born blind was undoubtedly snarky with the Pharisees, and there are all sorts of ways in which they deserved that. But could he have been more polite? Should he have been? And if you'll allow me to take this risk, should Jesus have just healed him and walked away and left him floundering? Forgive me. In other words, it's hard to read this story and pick a character and say, be more like this, kids. It's not that kind of story. Instead, it seems designed to entertain us, and even though I was basically just reading out of the Bible, you were actually entertained, even laughing. The story seems designed to entertain us with all the ways that we mess things up. Even when God is miraculously in our midst and doing amazing and wonderful things, what do? We go blind and we miss it. We quibble over rules. We fixate on things like, where is this fellow even from? We get scared for our reputations. We drag people to the authorities for no good reason. We get snarky. We lose the big picture of the story of love, instead focusing on winning little tiny arguments. For me, the fact that this story is in the Bible, the way it is written, gives us a kind of spiritual permission to laugh at ourselves. That's one way I read this story. If the Bible can find us funny, well, then maybe we can find us funny. And because it's such a well-told story, the laughter and the honesty, they go down pretty easily. And like all human beings everywhere at all times, we need that. We need laughter to help the medicine go down. The medicine of the honest, unvarnished truth about what it's like to be human. Thanks be to God for good storytelling that holds a mirror up to us and makes us laugh and enriches us spiritually, even if we can't quite put a finger on how it enriches us spiritually. So along with Sam, we can ask, what sort of a tale have we fallen into? Well, a story that is incredibly powerful and beautiful, yes. One that brings sight to the blind in all sorts of ways, yes. But also, we have fallen into the sort of tale that has room for storytelling and silliness and honesty and laughter and satire. And for that, on this summer morning, thanks be to God. Amen.